Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today at SFFCon. My name is Stephen Fick. I run Davenport European Martial Arts School. I've worked with several authors on creating fight scenes for their novels and helping them create different feelings in their books. And I'm really excited about this because I want to hear what you guys do and how you do it. Would you take a moment and introduce yourselves to everybody? SJ, why don't you start?
Okay, I'm SJ Schauer. I'm the author-creator of the Spiral War Saga series of military space opera with a hard sci-fi basis, and lots of different combat scenes from large-scale space battles down to guys beating each other with empty weapons, with their pistols once they've run out of power, or they're just grabbing the knife because it's gotten that bad. So,
oh, that sounds like some fun fights to read. Jeffrey, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jeffrey H. Haskell. I'm the best-selling author of The Full Metal Superhero. I'm a former journalist. I was a member of the U.S. Army for 5 years, 2 of which I spent training with the 2nd Ranger Bat at Fort Lewis. I studied Shobu Karate for 6 years and unfortunately spent a lot of my childhood getting in fights. That's my qualifications.
And Kevin.
My name's Kevin McLaughlin. I have published 83 science fiction and fantasy novels of assorted lengths, but assorted indie and traditional publishers. And in the for the real world stuff, before I was writing, I spent 12 years in the Army as an infantry soldier, and 2 of that I was the combatives instructor for 2nd Brigade over at Fort Drum, and I spent 20 years total doing Eastern martial arts, and then about another decade doing Western martial arts, swords, maces, spears, stuff like that. So I've kind of done all 3: the pew pew, and the bang bang, and the pow pow.
Bonk bonk on the head.
Exactly.
Well, when everything goes wrong, there's always something you can hit them with.
That's right. You got to cover all your bases.
Or as the Black Knight said, "Get over here, I'll bite you."
Right.
I'll bite your kneecaps off.
Oh no.
One of the things that I'd like to know is when you are planning out your fight scenes in your books, do you have a plan that you go in with, or do you kind of feel it, let it write itself? And when you're doing it, how do you make it exciting for the reader but not overbog them with information? And just jump in whenever.
I think it depends on what's going on in the narrative of the story. If there's something that needs to happen in the fight, somebody needs to get hurt, somebody needs to go down, somebody needs to die, you have to work on that as a plan. Now, do you have to, plan every punch, every shot, every, cut of a knife? Not necessarily, because if you know where you want it to lead to, and you know where you're beginning, with myself, I tend to let it flow to get there. I think one of the things that I sometimes have difficulty with in that regards is how you get from guys 100 yards away shooting at each other to now being up close and personal. And sometimes you have to figure out contrivances of how does that happen? Why does that happen? How are they able to get so close when, modern or future combat doctrine is mostly going to be keep your distance and shoot at them, So they get forced into a hallway. They get forced into a ravine. They get, somebody's gun gets shot and it gets damaged and they have to get rid of it before because it's no longer functional, and now it's a club. Or, if it's an energy weapon, it's a bomb.
Well, tell the Marines at Fallujah to keep their distance. You know what I mean? That was some serious close quarters battles that luckily the Army still train, or the Marines in the Army still train people for. But that was, there was no keeping your distance there. So there's always those circumstances where, no matter what weapons you have, you're going to get up close and personal. The thing that drives me crazy is in movies and TV shows is when the bad guy is down or the good guy is down or whatever, and the other person walks right up to them with the gun, like
Right against
2
the head.
inches away, and I'm like, it's a gun, not a sword. Come
Yep.
on. Yeah, that breaks believability. But situations where you are in close quarters, because of terrain or because of logistical circumstances or just the mission itself, it is totally acceptable, and even it can be a lot of fun because it's a lot of making a scene exciting is taking people and putting them in situations they don't belong in. My current work in progress, part of the problem of being a writer with all this experience is that when you're writing characters, you have to start from the perspective of the character, and not every character is a tier 1 operator, BA, martial arts expert. Sometimes there are specialists who are really good in their field and suck at everything else. And so one of the things I did with my current work was the captain of the ship is not, though he's a big guy, he's 6'2", he's not a hand-to-hand combat person. He's not a gun person. So the first time there's a firefight, he ends up like falling down, breaking his nose, and just fumbling around with his gun. Doesn't remember to take the safety off, because if you've never been in a firefight before and you don't train for it, that kind of thing happens.
Yeah, it does.
And it was a line where you want to make him sympathetic but don't want to make him weak. And it can be tough to do that line, especially when we're used to writing people who are all John Wick, which I also write. So and it's just really interesting. You just got to get the head of your character and figure out what's their level of skill, what do they know, what can they do. And sometimes you look at, like, it would be obvious to just about anybody, do this, and you have to go, no, okay, well, I'm going to have them do this other thing, even though it was not something I would do, but it's something they would do. And
right, you have to get in the characters' heads.
Yeah, when you bring that level of immersion to the characters, the readers just follow right along. They love that stuff. And so the actual technical details of the craft for fight scenes, short sentences, long sentences, that kind of thing can is something you work out. I will always work out in edits, but the fight scene itself flows from the character through the goal of the fight, to the end. And whether they're an operator or someone who's never fought before, it can be a lot of fun.
Well, and I think you bring up a good point too, because you're talking the captain gets involved in a fight. And in reality, the captain's not the guy going on away missions, is not the guy handling the gun. Whereas if you watch most sci-fi, like your Star Treks and stuff, oh yes, the captain's down there and he's, being the A shot. No, that's the security dudes behind him.
Well, luckily he had 2 Marines with him.
Yeah.
But it was on a friendly base, on a logistics, support request. It wasn't even supposed to be, there was no chance of combat. So it was a great surprise. Because you're right, the captain is not supposed to be the person who's in the middle of the firefight ever. Those are Marines. That's what Marines are for. It's what the Army is for. And so you get that fish out of water element that can be a lot of fun. I read Starship Troopers. The whole training montage for Starship Troopers is great because you have these people who are really soft, no experience in battle or combat growing up. They're very privileged with their money, and then they go into this basic training that is just basically hell, and it's fantastic to read just on that premise alone.
I like what SJ said about the about knowing what your scene is supposed to do before you start writing it. So that's where, like, just the other day, as an example, I wrote the first episode for what's going to be a Vela serial, and then it's going to eventually be a novel release down the road. But the opening scene of this story is 2 guys at the final World Championships for mecha sport combat. So they're both inside of these, giant armored robots, and they're pummeling each other with their fists, essentially. So it is boxing, but it's boxing inside of a giant robot, which I thought was cool. And these guys are both experts. They're both the top of their game. So they're approaching it from that too. And I knew which character was winning. And that was that was my stage. They're in a stadium. They're in giant robots. They're both experts, so they both know what they're doing. And this guy has to win, and this guy has to lose. And then I just made it up as I went along from there. Everything else, I knew the parameters for where I was starting, their skill levels, what their objective was, what the setting looked like, and I knew how it had to end. And then everything else in the middle, I just kind of made up as I went along. Not unusual for me to actually stand up, especially for hand-to-stand stuff. It's not unusual for me to stand up and just be like, okay, so then he does this, and then and then, like do some of the choreography, like just do the movements, and then okay, now I can write down.
This is what my 15-year-old boy is for. I'll bring him over and be like, okay, hold your arm like this.
I'm writing a manuscript for my training system, and I'll sit at local pipe shops. I'll have pipe and coffee, and I'll be writing my manuscript, and I'll get up and I'll start going through my moves, and I'm sure everybody in the store is going, oh, he's back. So now, when we're talking about fight scenes, how do you use the fight scene to help with the character development? Do you plan the fight scene to help with the development of the character, or do you use the character's development to design the fight scene?
It's a little bit of both. And going back to Jeff's example of Starship Troopers, you know, especially if you're showing characters that are growing and learning how to fight, learning how to work as a team, especially, you know, you showed that first battle or that first simulated combat where they just get it handed to them, you know, because they're not together as a team. They're not cohesive as a unit. And, you know, you show progressively how they get better and better. You know, on the other end, there's the Ender's Game where he is the best and just nobody's listening to him. So you're seeing how he's the best, but, you know, people begin to listen to him as he goes on. I still love the book, you know, but it's still, you kind of look at it like, okay, yeah, you're a little too perfect in that regard. So, I mean, he's flawed in other ways. So he's still an interesting character. But if you're using it for character growth, the characters really have to go through something in the battle. They have to lose something, or they have to gain something. You know, sometimes it's just them learning that they have to let go and let somebody else, like, you know, the leader goes down and you've been telling the story from the perspective of the leader. And now you have to shift to the guy who's like, wait, no, he doesn't go down. That's the boss. He doesn't go down. So how do they react to it, especially when you're doing an ensemble piece like that?
Yeah, ensemble fights are a lot more complicated than the one-on-one fights because there's a lot of moving pieces. I know somebody told me they break out their minis, their Warhammer minis, and use that to choreograph their big battle scenes. And I haven't written anything that big. Most of my stuff is still, you know, a few people in on each other or ship to ship because my military sci-fi series focuses on one ship and its actions and combat, not like fleets or things like that. But in my main series, Arsenal, it's a team series, and the main character, who is, you know, a brilliant engineer who designed her own suit of armor, you know, similar to what Iron Man did, but with a lot of different motives and personality, has no idea how to fight at all. And the first time she's in a fight, she realizes the weapon that she designed that she thought was going to, you know, fix everything was useless against 90% of people. And so it's so part of her growth that in that fight scene was hugely important because you had to show her getting her butt kicked right in the beginning, but again, without showing her being weak per se, because people when they're reading, they don't like people who whine. They don't like entitled people. They don't like, you know, weak people. They like proactive people, and you can be proactive and lose. Mm-hmm. You know, and so that's kind of like the goal of the first initial fight scene is to have the main character be proactive, but lose so they have sympathy and that, you know, brings the reader in. And that, so yeah, most of my fight scenes do have a goal and a reason to be there. Sometimes though I'm writing and the flow says, yeah, I need an explosion here. And so something explodes and there's a fight. And those are cool. Not always story driven, but still cool all the same.
Nothing wrong with the occasional explosion in the middle of it, right?
No.
There are no problems so big that it cannot be solved with the proper application of explosives.
That's right.
Combat can be an interesting. Combat is a crucible in a lot of ways, and so whatever problems a person has, whatever internal conflicts they might have, those tend to come up in combat. You know, if you think you're brave, but you're actually really worried about getting shot, and all of a sudden the bullets are whizzing by overhead, you know, like it can force you to confront the fact, oh shoot, I'm not actually as brave as I thought I was. I'm not doing that thing, you know, or whatever the case might be. So in terms of showing character development, the crucible that is combat can be one of the most effective ways of doing it, I think.
How's the speech go? Battle is the fiery crucible which all true heroes are born. From Edge of Tomorrow. Love that speech.
That was a fun story, that one, Edge of Tomorrow.
The original manga is amazing.
What do you, each of you, what do you like best about creating these conflicts, these fight scenes, whether it's individual, mass, or multiple or mass? What do you like best about doing it?
Sometimes it just lets you cut loose, and it lets you get very visceral, you know, because for the most part, our stories are stories about characters. And so you're dealing with their interpersonal conflict. You're dealing with how they're adjusting to a situation. But when you throw them into a fight, now it's they have to focus or they're going to die, you know? So you get that very life or death situation where, okay, I have to focus. I have to, you know, what's down the barrel of my gun? What's at the end of my knife? Situation that pushes everything else aside for a little bit for them to really show a part of themselves that maybe isn't always shown, or shows them becoming something more. And sometimes I like to do it as just a means of critiquing other fights in movies and such. You know, as much as I enjoyed the Marvel Cinematic Universe, okay, I'm sorry, I had to go there. The Battle of Wakanda bugs me to all get out, because I'm just watching it going, why are they running up and fist fighting each other? Why are there not A-10s and B-52s blowing the heck out of the enemy line first?
For how
why is Captain America, a guy who we saw in World War II using guns, now just using his fists?
And even if they don't want to, even if they didn't want to bring in like the American military or something, you're going to tell me that Wakanda has no militarized aircraft that they could rake the enemy lines with?
Yeah, they have like 5 or 6 just kind of sitting there as gunships inside. It's like, no. You take those out first and just, you know. Same thing with the, you know, the final battle in Endgame. It's like, okay, you're in New York. The boys from Syracuse, the #1 A-10 squadron in the world, are 20 miles away. You know, I know the A-10 is slow, but it could have gotten there.
20 miles even slow by air is still going to be pretty fast.
Yeah.
There's a whole fighter squadron up in Burlington, Vermont that could be there in less than 5 minutes too.
Exactly. You know, so it's that kind of thing, you know, where we have these backgrounds where we're like, okay, we're having fun, but at the same time, God, guys, you know.
My biggest disappointment with the end of Endgame was the fact that you didn't get to see the Hulk get his revenge on Thanos, because I felt like they set that up at the beginning of Infinity War with the promise that the Hulk would come back and, you know, and win against Thanos, and then they didn't deliver, which is something fight scenes need to do. When you have a fight scene that happens, especially in the beginning, and your protagonist loses, that's a promise you're making to the reader that the protagonist is going to learn from that. And the next time that situation happens, they're going to be prepared.
Exactly.
So if that same situation happens again and they lose again, your readers may not realize overtly what has happened, but they'll feel a sense of dissatisfaction, general dissatisfaction with the story. And they might say, oh, your fight scenes don't feel very satisfying, or I didn't like the ending, or anything like that. So it's really, really important that when you be aware as an author that you are making promises with every single word you write. And woe to the author who does not fulfill those promises. My favorite example is the end of the movie Catching Fire, with the Hunger Games Catching Fire. And they've escaped the arena, and they're all on that drop ship or whatever, and they're, saying that Peeta is lost behind, and Katniss is laying on this bed, and the Jennifer Lawrence does such a great job, where she goes from scared to confused to angry. And then she looks at the camera in the last scene, and it's just like, man, she's going to kill somebody. And then you have 2 movies of her doing nothing. And so that was a promise. And when you make those kinds of promises, they're powerful, and they really invest the reader. But you also have to deliver on that promise.
Yeah.
Those are good points.
That's a very good point. I think that a lot of people are aware of the idea of like the Chekhov's gun on the mantle thing for a lot of other things, but I think it's also important to remember that that's true for fight scenes. The Hulk example is a great one. You have Hulk lose, and then you have Hulk refuse to come out, which implies to the viewer or reader that Hulk is going to eventually get over himself and then rise to the challenge again. And even if he doesn't save the day, he's going to prove that he has grown and become stronger internally and able to have the courage to fight Thanos, which doesn't happen, which is exactly what Jeff's talking about.
And all they had to do was have him land one blow on Thanos. It's not like they had to have him beat him. They just had to have him land a blow to prove to himself and the audience, hey, the Hulk is back.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
that would have done it.
Yeah.
Instead, they kind of did a. Now I can't think of the term right now, where they kind of gave that to Thor. Where you should have gone for the head.
Yeah.
And he does, but it's such a hollow victory that he falls into a big depression, and it's like, that's an interesting arc for his character to take. But you're right. You never get that payoff for the Hulk. You
don't get it with Thor either. Supposedly we'll get it in the next movie, but it won't be with Thanos, which is what it needed to be
with Thor, because he got his hammer back. He proved he was still worthy. He got to see his mom. We're spoilers from heck here. Sorry, guys.
Well, okay. So the narrative. This is a great example. The narrative said that he was worthy, but he didn't act worthy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's again, the Endgame has some points that are so good about it that the scene with Cap lifting the hammer and fighting Thanos to a standstill and stuff like that are so good that you overlook all these things. But when people are reading a book,
mm-hmm.
those kinds of you can't. Books are more pure form of fiction, in my opinion, and because you're inside people's heads when you're reading. Because I don't think any of us writes omniscient the way they used to, but so you're in somebody's head. So you, as the author who's controlling the narrative, can't have a character act cowardly and then try to tell the reader that, oh no, he was actually acting brave and you should like him. Because readers don't listen to what the narrative tells them. They listen to how the characters act. Sure. And if how the character acts and how the narrative says the character's acting are 2 different things, then you're going to have a dissonance and you're going to have a problem. And that was my big problem with Thor, is they kept saying how he was acting right or whatever, but no, he wasn't. And so remember, when you're in your books, is that you have to have those 2 things line up.
And the sum total of this sort of thing is what elevates a book from being okay to oh, that was fun, that was enjoyable, which was where I was at for Endgame. Yeah, it was a fun movie. Okay, but it wasn't like, oh my god, I gotta see that again right away. That's so good. And that's the difference. If you can create and fight scenes are part of this. Like if you can deliver the promises and show what you're telling at the show and tell, show what you're telling. If you're saying somebody is brave, they have to actually act brave. If you're saying somebody is good at combat, you have to show them being good at combat. Stuff like that. You create a situation where there's no dissonance between what you're showing and telling. I think you're much more likely to end up with readers loving a work instead of being like, oh yeah, that was okay, that was decent.
One of my favorite historical novels authors is a guy, Christian Cameron. He writes stuff right up my alley. Early 15th century, late 14th century, and his fight scenes. You love his main character sometimes, and sometimes you hate him. But his fight scenes really just draw you in. And when you're writing the fight scenes, what I want to know from you guys is, what do you find most challenging about writing your fight scenes, and how do you overcome those challenges?
I think sometimes one of the hardest things with writing a fight scene is choosing your perspective. You know, especially if you've got, you know, the ensemble fight, where you have a team fighting, and it's like, okay, whose perspective do I want to use for this scene? Especially when something significant is going to happen, that it's like, ooh, this would be really good to tell from that particular character's scene. But the rest of the fight, the rest of the chapter just doesn't flow from that character's scene, from that character's perspective. So you have to, if the characters are intimately familiar with each other, you know, they've been working together for so long, they know what the person is kind of thinking, you can work that in. So that helps. But I know my second book, the first chapter, I had to completely change the perspective on it. I had to change which character was perspective, because from the character's perspective that I originally wrote it, the sympathetic main character from the first book came off as a psychopath. And the beta readers were like, I've lost all sympathy for this character now, because from this perspective, and this is his best friend's perspective, he's a murderer. He's doing something absolutely terrible. So they're like, you need to put it back into his head to show why his actions are justified. And it was just like, okay, you know, because I wanted it to be from the other character's perspective, so you people could understand why he was so concerned about what happened there. And so that was a bit of a challenge. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I could see that being a real challenge. I could see also potentially doing the scene from the primary character's perspective, and then the friend have the reaction be from the reaction scene, the scene afterwards, being from the friend's perspective, where he's reacting to what he saw and what he just did. Now you've got the initial scene from the perspective of the hero, so you know why he was doing these things, and then immediately afterwards, you've got the friend's perspective, so you're seeing how the rest of the world might be looking at these actions here.
Yeah.
Just a thought. I don't know how you ended up doing it.
I ended up going kind of somewhere in the middle, where, I mean, it is mostly told from his perspective, but, you know, it's been so long since I wrote it.
That's okay. That's cool.
I know when I first started writing, seriously, to be an author, the levels, right? We all level up as we write, and we discover things that we have been doing since we began writing, and you're like, oh, well, that was so wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I made the rookie mistake in my first trunk novel that of describing every single blow. You know, right hand to, you know, left side of their jaw, you know, and step forward and spin, and it just, you know, and then I go back and read it out loud, and I'm like, oh, this is so clunky. But it took me a while of learning that, hey, there are instances where you want to be vague, and there are instances where you want to be specific. And your natural inclination is to be specific when you should be vague, and vague when you should be specific. So if you're writing a fight scene and you find yourself imagining every single action and reaction, you're being overly specific, and you need to be more vague. And that really makes the fight scenes, you know, no pun intended, or pun intended, actually, pack a lot more punch, because it's more about the emotions of the fight than it is about like what they're actually doing. What they're actually doing is cool, but it becomes secondary to how the fight makes the reader feel. In my secondary superhero series, it's a vigilante series. It's called The Wraith, and I build it as if the Punisher and Batman had a baby raised by John Wick. Which is why it was successful, because of that right there, that reaction.
Well, and I think you touch on something good there, because I mean, look at something. I mean, I hearken back to junior high English and when we read Romeo and Juliet. And if you read it and they describe the fights, it's just they fight.
Yeah.
You know, very super vague. But then when you watch any play of it, there's always, you know, all these very specific movements. The movies are very specific movements. Mm-hmm. So you're right. I mean, how much detail you give is important. And I think it comes, like you said, you know, you keep it vague until that need to be specific comes up, you know? So almost it's like, you know, okay, so they're fighting, they're trading blows. And now you sit there and say he drops to the left. And if your reader knows you, they're like, okay, he just went specific. Something really cool is about to happen.
Right. It's a cue.
You know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
That
really went well for me with the Wraith, because the Wraith was sort of my Punisher character, you know, for my superhero series, and she's, you know, she'd be described as a psychopath. I mean, she's, you know, she was her whole family was murdered in front of her, though, and since the first chapter is all about you coming to love that family, and then at the very end of the chapter they're all brutally killed, you're like, oh, okay, now I'm on board with whatever she does, up to and including cutting somebody's head off with piano wire from her high heel shoe, you know. So that specific to vague to specific is really, really important when you're writing a fight scene. You just need to, it's like kind of like writing a blurb almost. You need to take a step back and start removing things. Mm-hmm. Because if you try to get the reader to follow along a choreographed dance, they're not going to be able to. They're not you. They don't see what you see when you're writing it. But they can feel the blows landing, you know, your head getting smashed into the wall, you know, the knee hitting you in the stomach. They can feel that. And that's what you want. You want them to feel it, and keep it short and simple. And ideally, all the lead up to the fight explains everything the reader needs to know before the fight ever happens. It's kind of like Brandon Sanderson talks about his magic systems. The reason why his books work so well is everybody knows every single detail of how the magic system works. So when the characters use magic to solve a problem, the reader understands how the magic worked. So when your character uses martial arts to solve a problem, it shouldn't be the first time they've ever talked about martial arts. The reader should already understand that this character knows martial arts, or that this character is super strong, or that this character is a hell of a shot, that kind of thing. They should already know all those things. And so when that situation arises, you almost have a reader who's going, oh, I hope they do this. And then you do it. And then the reader's all excited because they were right.
Or if it's a
you know, go ahead.
If it's a surprise, it should be a surprise for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Like you had a character who looks like they've been, you know, like a mousy nerd for the whole, you know, for the whole story so far, for the first few chapters, and then there's a fight scene, and all of a sudden you find out that they're, you know, that they've got, you know, they're
really badass,
whatever. Yeah, there has to be a reason for this. So the reader's going to, okay, why? I'll give you this for a minute or two, but you didn't tell me why.
Yeah.
In terms of pacing, one thing I wanted to add too was that there's a sentence structure is a lot like chapter length. You know, everybody knows that the longer the chapter, the slower the story feels to the reader. If you want to, you know, if you run your chapters shorter down to like 1,500 words or less, the reader will feel like the story is progressing faster than they would if the same words were written at 3,000 words a chapter. It's just a perception. So the same is true of sentence structure. So the longer your average sentences are, the more the reader will slow down, and the more you feel like you're in kind of bullet time in a fight scene. Whereas if you do short, fast, punchy sentences, just, you know, like quick action beats, a few words, and then a few words, and then a few words, and you're tending toward mostly these shorter sentences, readers will read along and they'll feel like the pace is actually increased. It's a really interesting little bit of psychology, but it's a powerful tool for our toolbox.
Yeah, it's definitely something I use, especially when you're getting into the thick of the battle, and it's just one thing, and it's just
And then if you want to slow it down for a minute or two, if you want to do that little moment of bullet time, essentially, I know we're borrowing matrix terms and all kinds of stuff here, but if you want to do that moment of slow introspection, that's when you lengthen your sentences for just a little bit.
Yeah, and on that same topic, it's really important to have your characters behave. You were saying human psychology, behave in a way that is realistic. And I don't mean like what weapons they use or whatever. I mean like emotionally, viscerally, as a human being, behave in a way that's realistic. You do not think and then speak and then feel. You always feel first.
Mhm.
You know, so something happens, you get shot at. You don't tell people, "Hey, take cover," and and then feel scared. You feel scared first, because if you don't put the reaction of the feeling first, then it's entirely possible for someone to infer a different emotion for that character, and then when you get to the actual emotion that the character is feeling, they will have dissonance, and they will not. They'll be like, something's wrong here. And so it's really important. Something happens, you feel, you think, you act, you speak, and it's, if you change that order up, it's going to feel wrong.
It's almost like the OODA loop.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Observe, orient, decide, act.
Yes.
And you're constantly going through that loop with every action. Every small change, you have to observe, orient, decide, act.
Yeah, stop and think. When we trained in the military, and when I trained personally, a big part of it is overcoming your initial inclination to react without thinking.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you're going to be right and sometimes you're going to be wrong, but you'll always be wrong for acting without thinking.
Yeah.
And so
as always, there's a visceral feeling to to seeing a bullet knock the leaves off the branch next to you. You feel that deeply, and I don't think there's any human being who doesn't have an immediate visceral feeling reaction to that sort of encounter.
One of my favorite movies is Heartbreak Ridge, and all these Marines are running through the path, and all of a sudden Gunny Highway steps out with that AK-47 and opens up on them, and they all freak out and scatter in a bunch of different directions. And he's like, "Oh, this is an AK-47, the preferred weapon of our enemy, and it makes a distinctive sound when fired upon you." And it's like, yes, it does.
Yeah. When I don't know if you've ever read anything by his name is Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He wrote a book called On Combat, On Killing. He was a psychologist for the Army and has worked with law enforcement. And he talks about the physiological and psychological effects of being in a combat situation. How do you write the psychological response to fear, combat, any of those things in such a way that you not just tell the reader, "Oh, he's scared," but you draw them into that feeling, and you can see the psychology and the physiological changes within the scene?
I think a lot of it depends on the character themselves, and how they react to combat. There's the old standbys of, you hear combat, you hear gunfire, your heart starts to race, your palms get sweaty, your mouth goes dry. Those are physiological reactions that everybody recognizes, and says, okay, yeah, this person's just, they've gone into battle mode, they've gone into fight or flight mode. And even then, going into that fight or flight instinct of every muscle in their body is yelling at them, run away. You are outgunned. You are outmatched. And it's them sitting there saying, no, I have to do this. I have to stay. I have to be the delaying action, or I still have to get the MacGuffin. I can't turn back. So those physiological reactions and how people fight against them, I think, are very good ways of describing that, especially with the initial of combat. And as the combat goes on, as you kind of numb yourself moving forward, to what is happening around you before something else happens, and you're like, oh, how did that happen? So
interesting. A lot of physiological changes. Sorry, Jeff. Go ahead. It's interesting. The physiological changes can vary based on the person's experience level too. Like the physiological changes of a person who's never been under fire before, and somebody who's been like in the infantry for 20 years and they've been deployed a whole lot of times. The wildly different. Like I've been out of the Army now for almost a decade, and or a little over a decade, and my heart rate still slows down when I'm doing things like playing Halo, because I'm under fire, and my body knows I'm under fire. My heart rate needs to slow, and I need to become incredibly calm, and everything sort of like this much more calm, relaxed mode. And that's just how I adapted to being able to deal with that sort of thing. I know a lot of other guys do the same thing. It's not really uncommon for people to start, their heart rate will actually start slowing down as they enter combat situations. They become cooler and calmer and more relaxed.
Or they laugh.
Really the best thing in the world. I mean, not relax, but you know what I mean. It's maybe not the best reaction in the world, but it's not really uncommon.
Because they understand that panic is going to lead to very bad things. So you learn, okay, drop back into battle mode, slow everything down, think logically, take aim, do what you got to do.
Well, like I always tell my kids, decisions made through panic and fear are always the wrong decisions. And I was going to mention the thing about the level. It's like also your level of training. Too many times I'll see movies or read books where people have been really well trained and they'll go into combat for the first time and they'll all freak out, and some of them will run away or whatever, or jump up and not know what to do. And like in World War I, that was fairly common because people were fighting a war with weapons that the world had never seen before. Asking people to stand up in a line with machine gun fire coming at you, because that's how they fought with muskets. You totally expect that line to break. But the couple of times I was in interesting situations in the Army, nobody freaked out, nobody panicked, nobody ran away. I mean, these are you're trained soldiers. Now, if you're civilians, if you're with people who've never been in combat before, that could be a completely appropriate and correct response. Though I think a more realistic response is they freeze and don't do anything. Because if you haven't been trained on what to do in response to an emergency, your brain tries to do 6 things at once. And of course, you jam up and freeze. So I've had this argument with people who weren't in the military on many occasions. And I'm like, listen, you fight how you train and you train how you fight. And that's why we train every single day of our existence in the Army, is so that when the crap hits the fan, you're not ejecting the magazine on your M16 and dropping the grenade and throwing the pin, which is something somebody did in basic.
I've seen that done.
Well, yeah, and the thing is you can always see the deficiencies because it's the places where you train the least. You throw a grenade once a year in the Army outside the infantry. So of course, when you do it for real, there's going to be problems. You reload an M60, or at least when I was in, I don't know what they use now, twice a year at training, and of course you get to combat. Of course, there's going to be problems. So the places where you train are the places you're going to be best at, and it's really great to have that sort of dichotomy between a trained and an untrained person. Denzel Washington was in a great movie called Man on Fire. And in it, he's mentoring this little girl, and he tells her, "There's no such thing as brave. There's trained and there's untrained."
Yeah.
And that's it. Yeah. I disagree with that. There's no such thing as brave, but I like the point in the movie. There's trained and there's untrained.
The point he was trying to make was a valid one. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and along those lines, I remember, I think it was my second book, while the characters are going through training, they're going into a special operations training while they're also taking their regular classes. And one of the characters is attacked in a test. They're taking just a regular finals level test, and this robotic assassin that's made up like an enemy drops in, and she's just like, okay, screw it. What do I have at hand? and basically takes her pen, stabs it in the eye, kicks it into the aisleway, and it's just like, well, crap, that was my pen, is her reaction. And somebody else is just, one of the other special ops cadets is like, here you go. And everybody else is like, she's just like, yeah, whatever. You know, I got to take my damn test.
That's great. Yeah, I love that.
The thing you got to watch out for on the reverse end of the same spectrum is watch out for Karate Kid syndrome. Like a 15-minute training montage does not make somebody a black belt.
Yes.
And
Right.
in like I cannot tell you how many movies you have this character who is like this wimpy, they don't know anything, and by the end of the film, they're an expert at everything.
Yeah.
Karate Kid's one of those movies though that you look back on now and you're like, oh my God, what was Mr. Miyagi thinking putting this white belt against a black belt? He should have been creamed.
In all fairness, those kids who had the black belts probably didn't have black belts. You know what I mean? Like I met 8-year-olds with black belts because in certain martial arts schools they hand those out as rewards for being there for 2 years or paying extra money or whatever. You know, Walt Robillard, who does Coffee and Concepts on Keystroke Medium, who is a hand-to-hand expert, has a school that he teaches Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I think, and he's had people walk in with black belts, and the first thing you have to do at his school is you have to fight, so they can assess where you actually are. And he says 90% of the people who walk in with black belts in whatever martial arts do not know the first thing about fighting. And it's kind of like public school, right? I mean, like someone comes out of public school and says, "Oh yeah, I took physics class in public school." Okay, well, what's the formula for light speed? So it's
travel.
So it's really so for the Karate Kid, I was in karate at the time. I was taking karate at the time that movie came out. That dates me a little. And I remember watching those guys fight and thinking, I talked to my sensei about it, and he's like, yeah, well, that is karate, but that's all stuff you did as a white belt. Those are all kicks and punches you learned as a white belt. Yeah. Having fought actual 6th degree black belts in karate, there's no way that kid was a black belt. There's no way, because you don't get up. But you don't even know you've been hit. You're just down.
Right, though, because like I own my own Taekwondo school for 7 years. And I had blue belts who I could have dropped into the local black belt tournament competitions, and they would have looked decent there. They might not have won, but they certainly wouldn't have looked wildly out of place. Because a lot of schools just don't do the same level of quality training.
Which is a great thing you can put in your writing too, because you can have people who are like, "Oh yeah, I'm a tier 1 operator, blah blah blah." Because we all met people like that in the military. Oh, yeah. This and that and the other thing, and then the crap hits the fan, and they're can't figure out which end the rifle goes.
There's a big difference between training and actual use.
It's true.
There's another book that I use at my school a lot. It's called Meditations on Violence, and it was written by a prison guard who was also a martial arts teacher, and he talks about the difference between martial arts and violence, and they are not the same thing. And I tell people at my school, I use martial arts to teach violence, not that it is violence, or not that it's just martial arts. And when you're doing the training, or when you're writing for the training, when you're writing for the experience, I have one. Let me back that up. I have one last question I want to ask you guys. Have you ever written a fight scene from the same scene from multiple perspectives, like vantage point? Have you written that, and how do you go about doing that? And tell us.
There's a technique called pass the baton. Everybody always like, "Oh, don't head hop, don't change POV." That's easy to say, because people say that because it's easy to say, and unless you know what you're doing, it's really hard to do. But unfortunately, it's become dogma, right? You're talking about writing a fight scene from one perspective, and you absolutely do not have to. The guy who wrote what's the name of the book? Oh, my brain's freezing. It's great military sci-fi. I thought the guy had been in the Navy. I swear he'd been in the Navy. It turns out he was just a history professor. Poor Man's War. It's published by Amazon. Fantastic novel. The end fight scene is the main character in a fight with several opponents, and every time he punches one of them, it switches to their perspective and their reaction to that, and then it just moves along that line like a lightning bolt, like electricity. And so you can pass the baton in a lot of ways, the way movies do, where something your character does interacts tangentially with somebody else, and it's their perspective. And since it flows in space and in narrative, it doesn't disrupt the reader. You're not all of a sudden in somebody's head across the battlefield who has nothing to do with the thing that just happened. That would be head hopping. That would be a huge mistake. But you can change perspective in a scene as long as you are flowing from, like water, from one point to another naturally along the path and stopping and seeing people's perspective. Because sometimes you need a perspective that's 2 sentences long. You need a reaction, but you can't have a reaction without the action. And you can't, for instance, in my superhero series, the main character flies around in a suit of armor. So when she does stuff, she's usually not in the vicinity of the reaction because she's flying along at 600 miles an hour, doing what Iron Man should have been doing to those aliens who came down in the Battle of Wakanda. Well, not Iron Man, Rhodes. But so sometimes you need just a sentence. David Weber is a master of this. He will write a battle scene, and Honor will do something, and then there'll be a space, and then there'll be like a 3-sentence reaction from the enemy captain, like, what the hell is going on? What are you people, a bunch of amateurs? And and then you're back to Honor. And you can totally do that. You just have to know what you're doing. The old know the rules to break the rules. You have to know what you're doing with perspective, and you have to have it flow exactly right. If you've ever gotten to the end of the chapter, or if you've ever been writing toward the end of a chapter, and you wrote a sentence and you go, oh, this is where the chapter needs to end, even though there's more that you're supposed to write, then you have an idea of what that feels like, that flow of how a story should go. And you need to hold on to that when you're writing a fight scene, if you want to write a fight scene with multiple perspectives, without changing chapters or having clunky scene breaks, which take people out of the fight.
It can be an unclunky scene break, right? I mean, with Weber's stories, a lot of the time he does use an actual scene break.
He does, yeah. But there are instances where he doesn't.
And there's a short, 2-paragraph scene where they've clipped to the enemies or they've clipped to somebody else, and you're back to the main character's perspective again. He headlocks a lot in his fight scenes.
He does, yeah.
Obelisk Station in that final fight scene, he's popping all over the ships, But
when you notice though, he only uses the scene break when he's changing location. He doesn't use a scene break within the ship. So that's so you can have a perspective, a reaction and perspective from somebody who's right next to you without using a scene break. But if you're changing locations, then you absolutely need a scene break.
SJ, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I actually really agree, especially when you're, and it's actually making me think to the book I just finished and sent off to the editor, and I'm like, maybe I need to do a little bit of that in there. Because I used to do that a lot more. I used to do. I mean, I think back to some of my earlier books where it's like, and this is a game. They're playing basically let's just say call it future football kind of thing, and it's shown between 3 different characters' perspectives, and it's okay. Where's the point to switch from this person to this person to this person and then back, or flow through? And it is like you said, it's the lightning effect of we had this action from the from character A goes to character B, and now it flows on through the rest of the way. So that really makes me think that I could think of 2 very specific scenes in my latest book that I'm like, maybe I need to talk to the editor about doing that, because the one is would be a very short head hop. It goes from the lead to his second in command, who is facing off against these hinted at aliens that nobody really should want to be fighting hand to hand because they don't lose in hand to hand.
Right.
So it's like, okay, would it be good to hop into this character's head? Maybe I should, maybe I ought to, go back and, rewrite that scene. And then again, the final fight between him and the main POV bad guy, it's like, maybe I need to pop into that head for half a page, as things happen, and not just get his perspective, because having just his perspective is limiting. You're not getting all the emotion that's going on. You're getting his interpretation of what's going on. He sees this person and it's just like, holy crap, I can just tell by the look on that dude's face. He wants to kill me, and not just, this is an enemy soldier who wants to kill me. This is a guy who has a vendetta against me, and it's like, okay, but he has no idea who this person is.
So
the other guy does.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to close up here. There's so much more that I'd love to talk to you guys. SJ, Jeffrey, Kevin, thank you so much for spending time with me, for answering questions. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did.
Glad to. Always good to be here.
And me to get to be on this podcast with you, Kevin, because I've been wanting to meet you for a while, and it was really great to hear that you've read all the same books that I have read.
Oh,
and
hands of the same people, Jeff.
Affirming my knowledge that you are an awesome person. And SJ, it was great to meet you, because
it's good to meet you all.
I haven't met you before, and it was fantastic to hear your perspective.
Definitely.
Stephen, you too.
So thank you, gentlemen, for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at the next panels.